Welcome to another touching story that highlights the importance of standing up against prejudice and fighting for justice. In today's tale, we explore how one man's courage brought down a tyrant in his community, proving that karma always comes back around. Margaret Langley's reign of prejudice. Margaret Langley was a name that evoked fear and resentment in Oakridge Estates. As the HOA president, she operated with an iron fist, wielding her authority like a weapon. She patrolled the neighborhood daily, her sharp gaze scanning every corner for any perceived infractions. A blade of grass too long, a car parked slightly off-center, or a flower pot placed too close to the sidewalk would all earn homeowners a stern warning or a hefty fine. Margaret thrived on control, but her rigid enforcement was merely a cover for her deep-rooted prejudice. Her disdain for minorities was no secret. Margaret often made disparaging remarks masked as concerns for the neighborhood's standards. She believed that people of color did not belong in Oakridge Estates and saw their presence as a threat to the pristine image she desperately wanted to maintain. Using her position, she targeted minority homeowners relentlessly. Random inspections, fabricated complaints, and excessive fines became their daily reality. She spread malicious rumors about them, often suggesting they were involved in illegal activities or were financially unstable. Margaret's tactics were insidious. She manipulated the HOA rules to make life unbearable for those she deemed unworthy. If a minority homeowner installed a new mailbox, she would claim it didn't meet community standards. If a child of color played in the front yard, she would cite noise disturbances. Her harassment knew no bounds. Margaret even went as far as influencing other board members to support her biased decisions, ensuring that her targets had no allies. Homeowners lived in constant fear of her. Complaining against Margaret was futile, as she had built an empire of intimidation. She often threatened to raise HOA fees or impose new regulations if anyone dared to challenge her authority. Many residents, especially minorities, felt trapped in their own homes. Margaret's presence at community events was dreaded. She would often make passive-aggressive comments, thinly veiled as jokes, leaving her targets humiliated. But Margaret's reign wasn't just about rules. It was about power. She relished making others feel small and insignificant. She kept meticulous records of every minor infraction, ready to use them as ammunition. Her power plays extended beyond homeowners. Delivery drivers, gardeners, and maintenance workers, especially those from minority backgrounds, faced her wrath. She would berate them publicly, often threatening to report them to their employers for trivial reasons. Margaret's discrimination extended to the housing process itself. She pressured real estate agents to avoid selling homes to minority families. When that failed, she would harass new homeowners until they considered leaving. Her mission was clear: to maintain Oakridge Estates as a predominantly white, affluent community, no matter the cost. What made Margaret particularly dangerous was her cunning nature. She was careful to avoid direct evidence of her prejudice, often couching her discriminatory actions in the language of community standards and property values. But the residents knew better. Stories of her harassment circulated widely, whispered in hushed tones during neighborhood gatherings. However, fear kept many from speaking out. Despite her oppressive tactics, Margaret viewed herself as a savior of Oakridge Estates. She believed she was preserving the community's integrity and often boasted about her contributions. She reveled in the power she held over others, convinced that she was untouchable. Yet, beneath her polished exterior was a woman driven by insecurity and fear of losing control. Margaret's prejudice wasn't just about race. It was about maintaining dominance. Anyone who challenged her authority, regardless of their background, became a target. She thrived on division, ensuring that residents distrusted one another. Margaret's reign was not just a period of strict rules but a dark era of discrimination, manipulation, and fear that left an indelible mark on Oakridge Estates. First encounter with James Carter. James Carter's arrival at Oakridge Estates marked the beginning of a quiet yet profound resistance against Margaret Langley's reign. A retired military veteran and former detective, James was known for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect. His past was filled with stories of bravery, critical thinking, and an unwavering sense of justice. When he moved into the neighborhood, he sought peace and tranquility, but Margaret saw him as an unwelcome disruption to her carefully controlled environment. From the very first day, Margaret's hostility was evident. She watched James move in from behind her lace curtains, already plotting ways to make him feel unwelcome. The sight of a black man in Oakridge Estates was, to her, an affront to the image she wanted to maintain. Within hours, she had sent an email to the HOA board expressing her concerns about the new resident, subtly implying that his presence could negatively impact property values. James, however, was no stranger to prejudice. Years of serving in diverse environments had taught him to recognize and handle discrimination. He noticed Margaret's prying eyes and felt the weight of her disapproval, but he chose to ignore it initially, hoping to avoid unnecessary conflict. However, Margaret had other plans. The first encounter between Margaret and James was as tense as it was revealing. James was watering his plants when Margaret approached him, feigning politeness. "We have very high standards here," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. James, aware of the subtext, responded with a calm smile. "I'm sure I'll fit right in." Margaret's attempts to intimidate James grew more blatant over time. She would walk past his house multiple times a day, taking notes and occasionally snapping pictures. Rumors began to circulate, most of them started by Margaret herself. She insinuated that James had a dubious past, suggesting that someone like him could bring trouble to the neighborhood. One day, James found a notice from the HOA claiming that his lawn wasn't up to standard, despite it being immaculate. It was clear that Margaret was targeting him. James confronted her politely, asking for clarification. Margaret, flustered but unwilling to back down, responded curtly, "We have rules, Mr. Carter. Everyone must follow them." James nodded, realizing that this was just the beginning of a long battle. Margaret's attempts to isolate James didn't stop there. She approached other residents, warning them about him without any basis. Yet, James's genuine kindness and willingness to help others began to shine through. Neighbors who interacted with him found him to be respectful, intelligent, and friendly. Slowly, the seeds of doubt about Margaret's narrative were planted. James's past as a detective made him particularly observant. He noted every instance of Margaret's harassment, documenting each one meticulously. He also started connecting with neighbors, listening to their grievances about Margaret. It became clear that many residents were unhappy but felt powerless against her. The turning point came when Margaret accused James of a minor HOA violation in a public meeting. Instead of reacting with anger, James calmly addressed the accusation, presenting clear evidence that disproved her claim. His composed demeanor and factual rebuttal left Margaret visibly unsettled. James's presence in Oakridge Estates was more than just that of a new resident. It was the arrival of someone who wouldn't be bullied into submission. Margaret's first encounter with him set the stage for an inevitable clash, one that would eventually unravel her carefully constructed empire of prejudice and fear. James Carter wasn't just a man looking for a peaceful life. He was a force that Margaret had underestimated, and it was only a matter of time before her reign would face its greatest challenge yet. The 911 call, the day Margaret Langley called 911 on James Carter, was etched into the memory of Oakridge Estates. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when James decided to relax in his backyard, soaking up the sun after a morning of tending to his garden. Margaret, peering from her upstairs window, felt her blood boil at the sight. A black man, shirtless and at ease. In the neighborhood she believed she ruled. It was unacceptable to her. Fueled by her prejudice and a misguided sense of authority, Margaret reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled with anticipation as she dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report a suspicious person," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "There's a man in his backyard acting strange. I think it might be drug-related." She knew the implications of her words and intended to weaponize them. Meanwhile, James, unaware of the brewing storm, sipped on a glass of iced tea. The peaceful afternoon was shattered by the sound of approaching sirens. His military instincts kicked in immediately. Calm but alert, he noticed 2 patrol cars stopping in front of his house. He knew something was wrong. The officers approached cautiously, hands near their holsters. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity," one of them said. James remained composed. "Suspicious? I'm in my own backyard," he replied calmly. Slowly, He reached into his bag and pulled out his old detective badge. Former Detective James Carter. Can you tell me exactly what's suspicious about a man enjoying his afternoon? The officers, recognizing the badge, exchanged glances. The tension visibly eased. Apologies, Mr. Carter. We received a call, but clearly there's been a misunderstanding, one officer said, already regretting their arrival. James nodded, but his eyes drifted to Margaret's window, where he saw the curtains flutter. He knew exactly who had made the call. As the officers left, James stood there, reflecting on the incident. This wasn't just an unfortunate event, it was an attack on his dignity. Margaret had crossed a line, and James knew that her unchecked prejudice needed to be addressed. He wouldn't let this slide. Margaret, on the other hand, was livid. She had hoped for a different outcome, one where James would be humiliated and removed. Instead, her plan had backfired spectacularly. That evening, as James sat in his living room, he began outlining a plan. Margaret's actions couldn't go unchallenged. His years as a detective had taught him how to gather evidence and build a case, and that's exactly what he intended to do. Margaret had started the fight, but James was determined to finish it. The 911 call wasn't just a moment of conflict. It was the spark that ignited the eventual downfall of Margaret Langley. James's investigation. After the 911 call incident, James Carter knew that Margaret Langley wouldn't stop harassing him unless someone put an end to her reign. His instincts as a former detective kicked in. If Margaret wanted to play dirty, James was ready to expose her for who she truly was. Armed with his experience in investigation and a strong sense of justice, he began to dig into Margaret's past. The first step was gathering public records. James spent hours searching through property histories, financial statements, and past HOA documents. What initially seemed like a tedious task soon became fascinating as red flags began to appear. There were numerous insurance claims filed by Margaret over the years, each linked to supposed accidents that seemed too coincidental. James recognized a pattern. Margaret wasn't just a tyrant, she was a fraud. One claim stood out: a large settlement from a high-end department store after Margaret claimed she slipped and suffered a severe injury. James found security footage that told a different story. Margaret had deliberately staged the accident. Encouraged by this discovery, James dug deeper. He uncovered multiple cases where Margaret had sued businesses, each time walking away with substantial payouts. The further he went, the clearer it became that Margaret was a seasoned scam artist. But James didn't stop at financial fraud. He combed through HOA complaints and emails, eventually finding a damning thread where Margaret explicitly expressed her desire to keep minorities out of Oakridge Estates. Her words were filled with racism and intolerance, confirming what many had suspected but could never prove. As James pieced together the puzzle, he realized he wasn't just gathering evidence for himself. He was building a case that could bring Margaret down once and for all. Every late night spent reviewing documents, every phone call made to gather testimonies, and every moment of frustration only fueled his determination. Margaret Langley had made a powerful enemy in James Carter, and she had no idea that her entire empire of lies was about to crumble under the weight of the truth. James's investigation wasn't just a quest for personal justice. It became a mission to liberate the community from Margaret's oppressive grip. What started as a single act of harassment led to the unveiling of years of deceit, and James was ready to reveal it all. Exposing Margaret. The moment James Carter decided to expose Margaret Langley, he knew it had to be precise and undeniable. After weeks of gathering evidence, reviewing documents, and speaking to neighbors, James was ready. The next HOA meeting would be the stage, and Margaret's reign would end under the weight of her own actions. The meeting room buzzed with chatter as residents gathered, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Margaret, as usual, took her seat at the head of the table, exuding arrogance. She believed she was untouchable, but James, sitting quietly with a thick folder of evidence, knew otherwise. As the meeting commenced, James stood up. Before we continue with today's agenda, I believe there's a matter of utmost importance that needs addressing, he said firmly. Margaret raised an eyebrow, already irritated. Mr. Carter, this is not the time, she began, but James cut her off. Actually, it's the perfect time, he replied. James approached the front, placing his folder on the table. He projected a video on the screen behind him. The room fell silent as they watched Margaret's staged accident in the department store. Gasps filled the room. James then displayed emails where Margaret expressed her racist views and discriminatory plans. He explained each piece of evidence with clarity, detailing how Margaret exploited businesses and harassed minority homeowners. Margaret's face turned pale. She tried to defend herself, but every claim was countered by James's evidence. Neighbors who had once feared her now voiced their anger. Margaret's world crumbled as James laid bare her fraudulent actions and hateful intentions. The meeting ended with Margaret being removed from her position, her reputation shattered, and legal actions looming. James had not only exposed Margaret, but also freed Oakridge Estates from her oppressive control. Margaret's downfall. After being exposed by James Carter, Margaret Langley's carefully curated world unraveled faster than she could comprehend. Her position as the HOA president was stripped away in an emergency vote, and the community she once controlled now turned against her. Neighbors who had lived in fear of her retribution finally spoke out, recounting years of harassment, unfair fines, and discrimination. The legal ramifications were swift. Insurance companies reopened old cases, discovering the extensive fraud Margaret had committed over the years. Her bank accounts were frozen, and she faced multiple lawsuits demanding restitution for her fraudulent claims. With mounting legal fees and no source of income, Margaret struggled to keep her lavish lifestyle afloat. Her home, once the symbol of her power, was put up for foreclosure. In a bitter twist of fate, James Carter purchased the property at auction. Margaret, humiliated and broken, was forced to leave the neighborhood she once ruled. She moved into a small, run-down apartment, a stark contrast to the luxury she had enjoyed. Social media amplified her downfall. News outlets covered the story extensively, turning Margaret into a cautionary tale. Memes mocking her circulated online, and videos of her public confrontations went viral. Even her family distanced themselves from her, unwilling to be associated with her legacy of racism and fraud. Margaret's attempts to rebuild her life were met with constant reminders of her past. Every job application was rejected once employers discovered her history. She took on minimum-wage jobs to survive, facing daily humiliation from people who recognized her. The once feared HOA president now served coffee at a local diner, forced to smile at those she once looked down upon. Meanwhile, Oakridge Estates thrived under new leadership. James Carter became a respected figure in the community, helping create an inclusive and welcoming environment. Margaret, now a forgotten relic of the past, lived in solitude, haunted by the consequences of her actions. Her downfall was not just financial or social. It was a complete dismantling of the power she had abused for so long. The story of Margaret Langley and James Carter teaches us a profound lesson about the power of standing up against injustice. It highlights the importance of resilience, courage, and integrity. James's unwavering determination to confront discrimination and expose corruption serves as a reminder that no matter how daunting the challenge, truth and justice will always prevail. Margaret's downfall reflects the inevitable consequences of prejudice, abuse of power, and dishonesty. It reminds us that no one is above accountability and that the strength of a community lies in its unity and fairness. This story encourages us to speak out against discrimination and support those who fight for equality. It also serves as a powerful example that karma always finds its way back to those who cause harm. If you found this story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to Story Precious for more touching stories that inspire, educate, and resonate with the heart. Join our community and never miss our latest videos. Together, let's spread positivity, kindness, and important life lessons. Thank you for supporting Story Precious.